Our next speaker will be Anthony Pinter. Please continue to tweet at us and write down your discussion questions and your thoughts and ideas on the multicoloreds.
Hi, my name is Anthony Pinter, and I'm a graduate student at Penn State. At State of State 2017, I'm going to be talking about how including graduate students in Penn State activities might better us as a community. Hi. So like Video Me said, I'm going to be talking about inclusion at Penn State, but in a way that you probably haven't thought about before from a student status perspective, which is undergraduates and graduate students. So when I say the phrase, the Penn State experience, it likely conjures up a bunch of thoughts and memories and emotions for you that you connect very intimately with your time at Penn State. But if instead I said, define it for me, give me a concise sentence, you might be really hard-pressed to do that. Instead, you'd probably go back to those thoughts and memories and experiences about your time at Penn State. And so an undergraduate, for example, might highlight Penn State football, tailgating, thon, moving on, Greek life, or any other student org that you're passionately involved in. Nope, that didn't do what it was supposed to do. Sorry. So that's the sum of what an undergraduate might say is their Penn State experience, right? All these different things that you can be involved in during your 4 to 5 years here. If instead you ask a graduate student, you're going to get a very different response in all likelihood. A graduate student is going to highlight a graduate organization like GPSA, their cohort, or their lab, often your first form of social support as a graduate student, or a really cool talk or a conference that you went to that you found really enlightening towards your work and what you're doing day to day. But the thing that they're going to talk about the most is your thesis and your research and your advisor, because that's the core of a graduate student's Penn State experience, is what you're doing day to day for that person to graduate. So I highlight those two different kind of experiences to show you that there's a disconnect between the Penn State graduate and undergraduate communities and the way that they interact. The sources of this disconnect, these barriers, vary in size and rigidity. But the one I want to focus on the most today is these social situations. So thon, moving on, football, tailgating. And the question I want to ask is, why do we limit students on joining in these activities based solely on student status? To highlight that, imagine a student. And there are 3 different ways that Penn State views a student. You have legally, academically, and socially. By looking at these 3 different viewpoints of a student, we can figure out what can and cannot be changed and then apply it to the social sphere, the last of the 3. So looking at it from a legal perspective, there's a very hard disconnect, a very hard line, where Penn State defines graduate students to undergraduates in very different ways. So there are things that graduate students can do that undergraduates can't. For example, the one that I got as I was preparing this speech was that graduate students are allowed to work with prisoners, undergraduates are not. There's a liability issue there. Moving on to the academy and the way that Penn State views you as a student, there are again some hard lines. We probably don't want a freshman taking a 500 level class, nor do we want a graduate student taking a 300 level class. They just won't benefit from it the way that they're intended to. So that's an example of something that won't be able to be changed, right? There's no reason to change it. It makes sense. But then there are things that are starting to become a little more open. The IUG program, which lets students do a combined bachelor's and master's degree in 5 years, has recently become opened up a little more to non-Schreier students. In the past, it was an honors-only option. More recently, it's started to become open to any student who feels like they're academically motivated enough to complete it. So that brings us to the third view. And the third view, theoretically, should be we're all students, right? But in reality, there are still some divisions. And there isn't a good reason for that, right? Socially, we're all students. Why delineate it between undergraduate and graduate students? To illustrate this kind of these barriers that exist and kind of why they shouldn't exist, I want to point to thon. So Thon has explicit and implicit barriers that prevent graduate students from becoming involved. Explicitly, Thon has in their constitution that graduate students cannot be on committees, they can't be captains, they can't be directors. So the back end of Thon, you can't be a part of. However, a graduate student can be part of an org, a special interest org, or they can independently dance. So you can be part of the front of it, where you're raising money and dancing in Thon, but you can't be part of the back end. Implicitly, there isn't a framework to let graduate students know that Thon is something that they could be involved in as a dancer or as in an org, right? And so without this framework to let graduate students know that they can be involved, they likely won't be involved, right? And so unless you did undergrad here, like I did, you won't know that you could independently dance, and you won't go out of your way to try and get involved in that manner. This is really important, right? You need to think about, why do we have these implicit and explicit barriers based on student status? Because graduate students have skills that enable them to be successful. Time management, leadership, problem solving. If you think about it, those are skills that are very valuable in organizations here at Penn State. Returning to a more practical level, think about Thon. There are over 6,000 graduate students here at University Park, and I guarantee you all of them are passionate, talented individuals that could make a huge contribution to Thon or any other student organization. Should we limit their involvement solely on the fact that they have a bachelor's degree? Personally, I don't think so. So Thon is an extreme example on one end of the spectrum, where there are these very hard barriers against involvement. But there are other orgs that have a little more of a proactive response. Moving On just changed their eligibility from full-time undergraduate to full-time undergraduate and graduate students. So starting next academic year, 2017-2018, all students can be involved in Moving On from the back end of it, which is their committees, executive board, directors. State of State had their first graduate student on a committee this year and their first speaker. Hi. And Penn State Club Sports, which I was actively involved in as an undergrad, has several clubs that were founded by graduate students, right? And so they've always been open to graduate students as long as you're full-time. So there's obviously a precedent here for graduate students being involved in these so-called social settings, right? So the question is, why don't all orgs do this? So I want to challenge you today to think about what you're involved in here at Penn State, and how opening up your organizations or your passions, your activities to all students might benefit your organization, benefit those individuals, benefit you, and benefit the community as a whole. I really think the questions that All In at Penn State ask on their website might also apply here, even though it's a slightly different view. Namely, what does it take to build a close friendship with someone who is different from you? And what does it take to put yourself in situations where you feel you don't belong in order to meet new people? I would suggest that the very first step to that might be being allowed to join in the first place. So in conclusion, we have a really famous chant. We've heard it a few times today. So it's "We Are Penn State," right? It's not "We Are Undergraduate Penn State." It's not "We Are Graduate Penn State." It's simply "We Are Penn State." So whether you're at a Penn State football game, at a spa concert, Moving On, any activity, why not just be a student? Thank you.